So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Danielle Daw. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at the Halton Hills Public Library and one of your hosts for this evening. So I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which the Halton Hills Public Library stands is part of the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I also want to thank the Friends of the Halton Hills Public Library for their support of our One Book, One Halton Hills program. So before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. The Q&A for tonight's event will take place through the chat box. So for those of you on a computer, you can access the chat through the menu at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. Now, if you're on a phone or a tablet, the option to enter the chat will be under More in your menu options. And when you're submitting a question, we do ask that you direct it to everyone rather than an individual so that the entire group can see the questions that are being asked. We are also recording tonight's presentation. It will be available on YouTube later this month. And now it is my pleasure to introduce my co-host for this evening, Janelle Thomas. So Janelle is the founder of Halton Black Voices, a new grassroots collective that aims to build stronger communities by empowering Black community members of all ages. The group also connects with allies for reciprocal educational opportunities, such as tonight's One Book event, with the intention of creating spaces of mutual understanding and respect. So one of Halton Black Voices' goals is to encourage critical thinking about the roles we all play in maintaining current inequalities so that together we can discover new pathways towards a more fair and just society. So Janelle joins me tonight to lead our discussion with Jael Richardson about her novel, Gutter Child. So Janelle, I will hand it off to you.
Thank you, Danielle, for the introduction, and welcome again to One Book, One Halton Hills 2021. Again, my name is Janelle Thomas, and I am your co-host for this evening. Tonight, I am with the one and only Jael Richardson, the author of the novel Gutter Child. Now, this book was hard for me to put down. It's filled with so many high emotions and recognizable traumas. It's also a story about love, hope, and Black motherhood. Gutter Child reveals a young woman's journey through a fractured world of heartbreaking disadvantages and familiar injustices. Elimina is a survivor who must find the courage to determine her own future and secure her freedom. Set in an imaginary world in which the most vulnerable are forced to buy their freedom by working off their debt to society, Gutter Child uncovers a nation divided into the privileged mainland and the over-surveillance Tzosi people. So welcome, Jael.
Thank you. I want to start by saying thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for doing this kind of a program and for selecting Gutter Child. I'm an ambitious person. So when I set out to do things, I have goals and I have dreams, and I have hopes. And one of them was to be a part of this kind of an event where an entire community would read my book. And mainly just, I thought it was really cool that a group of people would gather together like a giant book club. So I'm really, really excited to be here. I'm excited to talk to you about Gutter Child. I live just down the road, literally right off Main Street, which in downtown Brampton. And so I hope that I see you all at a Georgetown Farmers Market or Brampton Farmers Market or at one of the libraries or at the park or in the gym, which is where my son I end up traveling for his basketball game. So do hope you'll say hello if you do see me. And I do hope I get a chance to come to the library at some point when it works. I thought that for tonight, what I would do is kind of walk you through the process of writing Gutter Child. I think when you create a dystopia, when you write any book, there's a story behind how it's made. And for me, writing this dystopia in particular, there was a very tumultuous, long journey involved. And so I thought for those of you coming to this, I'm assuming most of you have read the book. And so you know what's in the story. And I thought I'd give you sort of how that story came about. And so I'll talk for probably maybe 15, 20 minutes, and then I will engage in conversation with Danielle and Janelle, and then we'll open up to questions from you, because I think what's valuable in this is dialogue, right? The questions that you have and the things that I can offer in response. And so let me start. So for those of you who may not know, my first book is actually a nonfiction book called The Stone Thrower. And it's a book about my father, who was the first Black quarterback to win the Grey Cup. His name's Chuck Ealey. And I wrote that memoir about his life and about my life growing up Black in Canada. And so I had all these questions about what it was like for him growing up in the States in the segregated projects, and then how my life is different, and all these comparisons between the civil rights era in America and the experiences for me in Canada. And as part of that work, of course, I did a ton of research. And a lot of the research I was doing was about the 50s, 60s, and 70s in particular. What was going on then, what was happening in the streets, what was happening in politics. And so I became really fascinated by this system that was in place in the States and the work that Black Americans and others were doing to break down that system. And so my dad and I spent a lot of time, a lot of the book is me asking him what it was like and how he handled this and how he handled that. And he went to an all-white school, for example, and there was a story about him only being allowed to take a date from his community and what happened when he tried to dance with a girl from the school who was white. And so we would have these conversations about what his life was like, and I would talk about my own life. And the book ended up being turned into a documentary that TSN produced. It's available on YouTube for free if you ever want to check it out. But they ended up doing a documentary about me writing this book about my dad. So we end up going back to all the places we had been in the process of writing the book to film the documentary. And there's this one moment where we go into the projects where he grew up. And there's this 2, 3, maybe 4 Black men on the porch, sitting around on chairs talking, and they're about my age. And one of them says to my dad, "Hey, Chuck, I know you. You know my mom. She used to live like down the street from you. You guys used to be friends." And my dad's like, yeah. They're talking. And I'm realizing this man is the same age as me, living in the same place where my dad grew up. And I've grown up in Canada in an entirely different experience. I've never known poverty or challenges financially. My dad's always provided a very safe and secure home. And here he is in the same financial kind of situation my dad and his mother were in 28 years ago. And I was just like, what is it that was so different for my dad than his mom? And that was a big question that started actually as I was working, as I submitted the final manuscript for The Stone Thrower, started to like play in my mind. What's different about the experience in particular for women versus the experience for men? And that was kind of the beginning of the idea for Gutter Child, is like, what happens when you grow up in a world that's designed for your failure? And how does it differ for women than it does for men? And what are some of the things that play out? So that was like on my mind. And then we were watching the events of the Trayvon Martin case a few years later, and Trayvon Martin was shot on the way home from the convenience store by George Zimmerman, and George Zimmerman was acquitted, and they used the stand your ground law, sort of his right to protect and defend his property. And I was so angry, right? You get that anger when these things happen. And when George Zimmerman was acquitted, I was angry. And I was talking to my dad about it. My dad was like, of course he got off. The laws were built for someone like George Zimmerman. They weren't built for Trayvon Martin. And it was this really simple sentence, but all I could picture, like as soon as he said that, I was picturing that painting. I don't know who painted it, but the painting of the founding fathers signing the Constitution. And I suddenly realized there was this group of straight, white, married men who had signed and created this Constitution that formed the basis of America. And when they built that, they would have been thinking entirely about themselves, about what they would need, about what they would be afraid of, about who they would need to protect themselves from. They would not have been thinking about a young Black boy walking home from the convenience store as a free man. It just wasn't on their radar of concern. It wasn't their priority. And for me, that was when Gutter Child really started to take shape, because I started to realize, how is it that systems and nations are built and constructed? Who are they built and constructed for? Who are they built and constructed to intentionally leave out? And I wanted to see if I could create a world where I built a system that was designed for the character's failure. And I wanted to know what choices they would make and why, and how it would differ for women, for men, for 3 different women, for 2 different men, and what the repercussions of those choices would have for them. And the goal, and I'll get to this later, I'm sure, the goal was to build it up, to see how they'd make choices, and of course, to see the system come down. But as I started to work on the book, that became harder. That part became harder for me to navigate. And I'll talk a little bit about that closer to the end of the talk, because I want to talk about that last year. I finished the book in 2020. My last sort of review of the manuscript went in May, June of 2020, which was in the months after George Zimmerman died. And that really did shape where the book goes. But so that was the idea that I started out Gutterchild with. At the very beginning, I knew that there were going to be scars, and I knew that there was going to be debt. Those were 2 big dystopian premises that were very important to me. The debt really for me was important because I was trying to think about the ideas of generational trauma and how we sort of pass down the difficulties that are, like, I experienced things, or I was stressed and anxious about things that my father never really talked about, that I never really knew a lot about. But as soon as I learned about it, I was like, oh yeah, I worry about that all the time, right? Even though I lived in a very protected, very privileged community. And I wanted to think about how some carry more debt than others. Some carry more trauma than others. Some respond to trauma and debt differently than others. And so the debt became a really helpful picture for me to talk about that, to break down that sort of the hidden damages of race, racism, racial trauma, the things we carry inside us that nobody can see, but we can almost quantify, right? We can almost, as Black folks in particular, and I know other communities who've experienced trauma, you can almost quantify how much you carry around on your back, how much you carry on your shoulders from ancestors. And so that was a really important part. And the scars was an interesting one because I knew that was a visual I had in my head really early on, but I really wanted them to have also this visual marker of not belonging, not being a part of, or being somehow less than an oppressed group. And so the scars became important. And I'll say this, I'll let you inside my head a little deeper. I had questions at one time of whether the characters needed to be racialized or not, whether their skin color needed to be different if they had scars, or could it just be different colored people? And there was a lot of questions. And at one point I sat down with a girlfriend and was like, I don't know if I should focus so much on the Black experience when we talk about colonialism and systems, or if I should sort of broadly address many systems. And my friend said, so often we have to deal with other people, like other groups, and take on all these other stories and tell all these other things. And she said, there's nothing wrong with focusing on the Black community and really focusing on those unique challenges. And I'm so grateful for that conversation, because it was the kind of permission I needed. My agent, my editor are both white. And so there's these kinds of talks that I didn't know who to talk to and I didn't know how to answer them on my own. And it became really important because I realized when she said that the Black community is so complex, so unique and complex. You have Black folks who are from Black, like populations that are largely Black. So the Caribbean, many African countries where the majority of the population is Black. You have other Black folks who, because of the diaspora, because of slavery, because of, all these things, live in white, largely white countries, or countries that are predominantly white. And then you have Black folks who are in places like in countries in South America, where they are part of a group of people of color, but there is shadeism that happens as well. There's this sort of oppression that happens in different ways. And so the Black community is really unique in that we're spread all over the world. And we have some challenges that are similar and some challenges that are very different because of where we are geographically and because of where we've been raised. I was on a panel recently with a friend who talked about hearing stories about learning about African queens and their ancestors and all these things growing up, because she grew up in a country where that was part of their education. I, in my education, only ever learned about Black folks beginning at slavery. I literally, in all my education, it started with slaves arrived in America, and this is our story, as though that's the beginning of the Black community, and it's not. So I wanted to address race and racism, but I felt the scars were really important because it allowed me to create 3 separate groups, essentially. People in the gutter who have 2 scars, people on the hill who have none, and then Elamina who has 1. And so the scars became really important. All the characters in my mind are Black, even though I never use that term. And I tell people not to use that term. In my mind, that's what I was thinking about as I was writing. But the scars became an important way to differentiate those communities and to talk about the difference growing up in the gutter, growing up on the mainland as a gutter child, and growing up on the hill as a Sosi person with a longer history of freedom than those growing up in the gutter. So those were things that I was wrestling with over the 8 years it took me to write the book. I started the book in 2012 and it came out in 2021. And during that time, there was 1 year where I actually stopped working on it because I thought this is a terrible idea and I shouldn't I should write something different, something better. And what happened over that year is I realized I could not write the next thing until I finished Gutter Child. And so there came a point where I just said, all right, I'm going to finish this book and I'm going to put it out in the world, hopefully somehow, but I have to finish it in order to write the next thing. And so I started to work through some of these questions, some of these predicaments, especially with a dystopian world that you come across and it says, okay, there's a debt. How much is the debt? What's the actual number? What actually happens when you pay off the debt? How did this start? A lot of where I began the book was from Elamina arriving at the school. And I didn't even write the backstory that Ida tells. Some of the rules that sort of come out later in the book, I didn't write those in the first couple of years. Those came out as my editor was kind of like, but what does this mean? And how does this work? And what happens? What happens to pregnant women? And I was like, oh, I don't know. And so there were a lot of things that I had to answer over those 8 years. There were a lot of things that I had to pick apart and pull apart that were pretty difficult. I also was new to writing fiction. So I actually didn't have a very good process even of writing and editing my work. I would just like struggle through it. And one of the things that I learned probably around year 4 as well was I met with a writing friend. I went to a retreat in Saskatchewan and she told me, always write from the beginning to the end. And at that point, I had only been working on like the first half to 3/4 of the book. She said, always work beginning to end and only work on one thing when you're writing, so that you're not trying to make a perfect book with every draft. You're trying to make a draft that's better and better. And honestly, when people ask me for writing advice, that's the one I give them because it's such a time saver to be able to focus. First of all, the time saver in it is that you're always thinking about the ending. You're never able to avoid the ending when you write beginning to end. My endings are always terrible for a very long time. And I will get to the ending of this book before I pass it over. I will get to what happened in the end. But I always kind of just avoid them. And when I started working beginning to end, it meant that I was constantly thinking about the ending. I was constantly getting to the end and saying, yes. I was getting to a different end, as you'll find out, but I was always getting to the end. The other thing that was happening because I started working on just one thing, I was able to sort of accept that each draft was kind of terrible and each draft was just less terrible than the draft before it, as opposed to when you're trying to write a book and you think it has to be perfect, you look at that first chapter and you're like, oh, I could fix that. Oh, I need to fix that. Oh, I need to perfect that. And so chapter 1, 2, 3 end up sounding awesome and it all falls apart after that, because you keep finding things to correct in those first chapters, and working beginning to end on one thing meant I have to leave the beginning until I come back to it, right? I can't just keep perfecting those first few pages. And so those were things that I learned as I went along. Another thing I'll say is I was really being affected by life as I was writing it. One of the reasons I've sort of sworn that I will never take that long to write a book again is because so much happens in the world and in your life, that then I felt like I had to put it in the book. I had to sort of respond to the world around me. And at times that was difficult. The story of the healers, for example, came about because I was having issues with my church, and I was having issues with my church community taking a proper stand on issues of race and issues of social justice. And I felt angry and disappointed by the lack of engagement from them. And it led me to leave my church, which was a really, really hard thing. For any of you who've been part of a faith community and you've been a part of it all your life, and you see them doing things that are harmful and you have to leave, it's not just like, yes, I left and I stood up for this thing. It's a really lonesome experience. You have family, kids, like a whole network that's a part of that space. And so my writing The Healers was my way of sort of processing what I was going through personally. And then I'll also say the ending to get to the ending. That was not the original ending. The ending I had been working on for 8 years was very different. And when I saw what happened with Ahmaud Arbery, who was shot while running, and Breonna Taylor, who was shot in her home, and then George Floyd, I was, to be quite honest, a hot mess. I was personally going through a lot. I was personally struggling. Just a little, my brother-in-law had been assaulted by police officers in Canada, in Peel, and he used to play in the CFL and had to leave his career there. So I had lived a kind of trauma as a family through it. And these things just kept coming and kept happening. And I have a son, who was 12, and I was really like just overwhelmed. And I had this white editor, this white agent who were, very supportive of me, but also just could not understand what I was experiencing. And it meant that I was working on a book that literally no Black person had read at that point, and trying to come up with solutions for things without anyone who could really like weigh in and say, what about this? Or how would you feel about this? And so it was a really lonesome process of wrapping up the book. And what ended up happening for me is I kept coming to the ending, and it was a much, I would say, neater, more satisfying ending, like the kind of typical thing you might expect. And I remember going out with another Black friend for lunch and saying, like, what do I do? And she said, one of the things that's really dangerous in Black stories is this idea that like everything is better on the other side, or everything wraps up nicely by going somewhere else, or really pointing out some of the traditional narratives of Black stories as like, this is the promised land and they go here and this happens. And there's some dangerous messaging behind that. And there's dangerous messaging in the Black community that sort of implies that certain places are better than others. And there was just a lot to think about that she sort of put out for me, and it made me rethink, why had I thought about that ending? What were the things I've seen on TV, read in books, been shaped by, that tell me that this is a narrative that's good or better or whatever? And so I ended up reading the manuscript over and over and over again. And every time I got to that ending, which was an epilogue, I was just like, it feels like, not that it's bad, but it almost like it's another book, like it's another story. Like I can't just wrap it up there. And then as I got angry and angrier, I also just thought, I don't care about making people happy and satisfied when they reach the end of this book. I really don't. I really care about giving Elamina a journey that feels complete. And that really became the impetus for where the book ended up ending. I ended up thinking, I don't know what happens to Elamina. I don't know what happens to in these kinds of situations. And so many of us don't know what happens in these situations. There's stories that come on the news and then they're gone, and we never know how they wrap up. And so I really felt like what I needed to show was that Elamina had come to some peace and resolution about who she was and what her story was, and to really reflect that in her relationship with her son. and that everything else was for readers to unpack, discuss, and fight about. And that I was sharing with Danielle and Danielle before, I kind of felt good leaving so many questions for readers. In a way, it wouldn't have been an ending that as a reader I would have wanted to come to, but I ended up feeling like it was really important for people to wrestle with, like, what do you think happens to Elamina? What's realistically going to happen to her? What's realistically going to happen to DJ? What do you wish happens? And why might those two things be different? Why might you want to know that she's happy and married, or that she's safe versus where you think she is now? All those things became really important conversations that I felt readers should have with themselves, with their book clubs, with their classes. And I'm really happy with the kinds of conversations that have happened, even the ones where people have said they're very angry at me. I'm very happy with where that takes people, because I think that anger is very important. And it's truthfully where I was at. The message at the beginning of the book is what I would call is like my apology. It's like what I say, like, I know you're going to reach the end of this book and be like, what on earth have you done? And that message at the beginning for me was really about saying, like, I'm sorry for giving you this book at this time, because I would love to give you a comedy or a romance or something that's like a little easier to chew in hard times. We're in quarantine and we're facing like a big racial conversation. But this is all I've got. And I'm sorry that the ending may not give you all the answers you hope for, but I think that the frustration and anger you feel should actually lead you to some really important places. So that's kind of the journey of Gutter Child over these last 8 years. I'll also say, I'll leave it at that, because I think some of the other stuff might come up in the question time.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah. There is a question in the comment section now. This is from Katie. She's asking, what are you working on now?
Yeah. So as soon as I decided that was the ending, I felt, and again, like I said, one of the reasons I ended it there was because that's where I was at. I actually didn't really know what would happen to Elamina, what I wanted to happen versus what would actually happen. And I couldn't quite reconcile that until I just said, this is Gutter Child. This is a book on its own. But as soon as I submitted Gutter Child that way with that ending, I started working on a sequel. And so the sequel will come out in 2023, hopefully. It will not take me 8 years. That is all I've promised people. It will not take me 8 years. But it's been really exciting for me to be able to continue on with the characters and to be able to resolve some of the questions that I have through the writing process. Because again, like I said, Gutter Child was about unpacking what I was seeing in the world, and trying to navigate it in the book to come to some kind of peace. Like, there was one point actually where I finished and I thought, is it possible to tear systems down? And I'm still wrestling with that question through the sequel, but it's initially I intended to see what happens in a system that's designed for your failure. And then partway through the book, I was like, is it possible to tear something like this down? I could see in building the world how easy it was to build new rules that reinforce the system. So the rule that sort of makes it more difficult for Rowan to continue on without supporting Elamina and his child. That was really easy. I was like, of course they would want to make that difficult. Of course they would want to make that harder. But thinking about how someone who's not part of the system would tear it down has been really, really challenging. And so that's what I'm working on and working through in the next book.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Yeah, I'm so blown away because I'm really looking forward to the sequel. So we've got some questions coming in, so I'm gonna keep rolling with the questions. This one's from Janet. She asked, I'm interested to know how you feel about the editors. Does it feel like they're interfering with your carefully crafted story, or that they help you, or have they helped you write the perfect book?
My editor is awesome. And their expertise is in how to structure a book, right? What's missing? Which characters are feeling incomplete. There was a point in which Mr. Gregors was feeling very stiff. And so she would say, when I read him, I can't quite picture him as a person. And oftentimes it's because you're using kind of tropes and stereotypes for someone. And so I had a lot of the mainland characters, actually, I had to do a little bit more work to kind of figure out their humanity, because really I did not like them very much, right? So it was easy to sort of be like, I don't care if they have a family. I don't care what their history is. But that's where your editor will sort of say, this character's flat, this is kind of confusing. And so I think on a technical level, they've been great. She's been super helpful. But I think when it comes to the Black experience, there's just nothing that she can offer, honestly. And that's always going to be a hard spot. I was actually talking about it with Lawrence Hill too, because it's something he goes through as well. You end up being the expert in the room on some of the material when really you want someone who is like an expert to weigh in and sort of craft and shape and say, like, be aware of these kinds of problems and be aware of these kinds of topics and issues that can come up in Black stories. And like, have you thought through this? The other thing that happens with a white editor for me is that they've read different books, and that can sometimes be helpful, right? They tend to have a different repertoire or resume of books that they've read than I have. And so sometimes that's good because they can bring in things that you didn't know. But for example, Sula by Toni Morrison was a big influencer of Gutterchild. And my editor had to go and read that on her own in order to be able to say, oh, I get what you're trying to do, kind of thing. So there's those kinds of obstacles, and I don't love them. But there's honestly actually not very many options in Canada. There are not very many, if any, racialized editors, let alone Black.
Interesting. And just to kind of piggyback off that question, so do you have Black editor friends or Black writers that you kind of consult with, or communities of people that you kind of consult with to get that lived experience?
Yeah, I do. I have Black writer friends that I go to for all kinds of things. I shared 2 of the instances where I went to them, but I have like a couple that I go to. When I was wrapping up the book, one of my friends, a Black woman I gave the book to, and my sister-in-law. So they were the only 2 Black women, Black people who had read the book before it came out. And so their feedback was really important and helped shape a lot of not necessarily what went into it, but like my confidence in what was in there. I think that was one of my biggest concerns, was that the book would come out and Black folks would be offended or, would just hate it. Like as a large entity, the whole group, every Black person would just be like, it's terrible. And that was a big fear because you just don't know. When you haven't had that opportunity to share it with them until it's published.
That's good. So we've got a question coming in from Ruth. They ask, as a big fan of Langston Hughes' poetry, I'm wondering if you considered including poems perhaps at the end.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked about the Langston Hughes poems. So all the poems that are referenced in the book are Langston Hughes poems. And initially, they were actually written into the text, but it came at the last minute. So this is another thing that happened May 2020 to July 2020. I had all these poems. Like I think I had 3 for sure that were written in full, and we found out finally that it was going to cost like $1,000 to $2,000 to put each one in, and it was going to be like a $10,000 bill essentially. And we had this long talk about like, how important is this? What are the options? And so I actually had to take the poems out and then create language that sort of hinted at the poems. And then because there was that, I also added a few more poems so that in each section, there was at least one and oftentimes two poems that were referenced, because I wanted the Blue Book of Poetry to actually have a more consistent thread through the whole book. So this was another change that happened at the very last minute. And this was a change that affected the ending and all these sorts of things, because I started to think about some of this stuff a little bit differently. But yeah, so I don't know. So it's tricky. There are rules about it. Like I could have used one as an epigraph. You can put poems at the beginning, like where I have I do have an epigraph there. You can put things there and you don't have to pay for them. But as soon as they're in the book or part of the book structure, you have to pay for them. And I don't know how it works if they're just at the end, but I don't think that ever really occurred to me.
Yeah, I really liked how, that book really bonds the kids at some point.
Mhm.
It really kind of builds that relationship and that love for each other and that trust over those poems.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons that the Alamina's 14. I really felt like I needed the main character and the other characters to be at an age where they were starting to think about the world. They were starting to look at the world differently. They would start to notice things and pay attention to things. And I kept thinking, well, how did I learn about race? Ian Williams has a new book out called Disorientation, and he talks about the moment where you kind of realize your difference, the moment you realize you're kind of set apart. And for me, that happened in and around that age. It became really distinct. And so I wanted them to be able to talk about it. And I honestly couldn't think of another way that they would do it without arts, like without music or something that would get them to begin to think about who they are and how they feel about their place in the world together. And so the Blue Book of Poetry was like a really exciting and important part of the story for me, because it became the place where they could learn from each other and also understand that the things they were experiencing had been experienced by people before them and would continue to be experienced. And that sort of understanding of your collective place in the world, I think, is really important. It's the beginning stages of doing something about it, because I think I didn't share this in the opening, but I grew up in a very white community, the only Black family on the street, largely white school. And my parents are both only children. And so I don't have any aunts or uncles or cousins. And the families that we grew up with were, that my parents connected with when they came to Canada from the United States, were all white. And so my understanding of Blackness and Black identity was very fraught. And by the time I got into high school, I was like, I don't know if I want to be Black or how I feel about being Black. And everything I know about being Black is from The Cosby Show and A Different World and Fresh Prince. And what does that mean? To only be the subjects of jokes and to be on funny shows. And then I would look at 90210 and Dawson's Creek and have this sort of who am I and what does it mean that I talk the way I talk, that I look the way I look? And it wasn't until I read Black literature in university that I started to understand what I was questioning was normal, what I was experiencing was normal, what the world taught me about Blackness from TV was wrong, what the world taught me about Blackness in history class and in the absences I saw in English classes was wrong, and that I just needed to take a concerted effort in doing something about it. And so that the Blue Book of Poetry was my way of helping these characters do something similar.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's interesting that, so I guess when you went to university, that was kind of your first experience getting into Black literature and getting into Black studies. How did you keep with that going into your writing? Have you always been kind of writing in that sort of lens? Yeah.
No, I did not start writing until after university. Going into university, I was more interested in theater. So I'd always thought about being an actor, and writing was just sort of a way of working with my theater kind of work. I had written plays and I was kind of playing around with that, but I never thought about writing a book until I wrote the story about my dad. And then I certainly didn't think about writing a novel until closer to the end of that time, when I was like, maybe this is something I want to actually keep doing. And one of the things that also helped shape my writing was this, when I met my husband, his family is like a huge, they're all from St. Vincent, and his parents, there's like 9 siblings on one side, 13 on the other, cousins, so many cousins that the first time we met, I had to like make a map and a chart. And I was like, how does this work? And seeing that kind of Black community and the richness of that experience made me want to read and study and look at things even more, because I realized what I had been missing and what I had, the kinds of assumptions I had made about myself, about the Black community, because I just didn't honestly I wasn't surrounded by enough Black folks to say like, yeah, that's twisted. Like, that's not the way it works. Like, I remember when my brother-in-law was assaulted by police, I was like, that doesn't happen in Canada. And the further we went into his case, the more people were like, this happens all the time. It happens all the time. It just doesn't get reported. It doesn't get talked about the way it gets talked about in the States. And these were things that like when I'm looking at 2020, the things that's so troubling is that shape shifting, that understanding of the world happened for me too. I had to like see the world as it really was. It had just happened 10 years earlier for me. And so when the rest of the world started, a lot of my white friends started to see, I was like, yeah, I've been telling you. But I understood what that sort of feeling was like.
Yeah, no, I completely understand that as well. So we're gonna go on to our next question from Colleen. They're asking, so our book club was trying to figure out where this book was set. Some thought Eastern US seaboard, others thought Southern US seaboard, alternate reality, Hawaii, Africa, South America. Where do you set this book? Before you answer, I personally thought maybe it was Eastern Canada. I like when you talked about mainland and mainlanders, I envisioned Nova Scotia. So that was kind of my prediction, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on where it was set.
It's interesting that where I haven't been asked that as often people ask when versus where. I think for me, the where is it's very much an imagined place, because I felt like I wanted to pull from all of those places. I was pulling from experiences in South Africa, experiences in Nova Scotia, experiences in the South of the States. You know, I was pulling from all of those things. And so building the mainland for me was like just erasing all the need to like specify one or the other. So in terms of like where, it literally was an entirely imagined place so that I could just pull whatever I wanted in and use whatever I wanted and kind of discard everything else. Because initially, one of the questions that was, I can't even remember how early it was, but I started asking like, what would have happened if we had lost the Civil War, right? What would the world look like? And some of the ideas for Gutter Child actually originated there. But then there became this challenge of like, do we do slavery, or are we the original inhabitants of the land? And it became like really messy. So I just said like, no, it's a nowhere land. It's just made up. It's got no rules. It's got only the history that I give it. And so that became really important. And then the time frame for me was actually like the 60s and 70s. Like some people talk about it as being futuristic. And I was like, oh, I kind of see it as an alternate history. Like it's set, you know, and part of it is like, I didn't want cell phones. I didn't want the internet. All those kinds of things were really important for me, that it was a lot more raw. And a lot of it was based on the research I had done on the 60s and 70s. And so, you know, the scene where she gets the pap smear and the doctor's office, I actually looked at like 1960s maternity equipment and 1960s doctor's offices, and I tried to pull from that time frame consistently. So that's partly also because the sequel, spoiler, the sequel happens 25 years in the future. And so it became important for me to kind of set it in a particular time more so than a place, so that I would have measurements for like what might have changed and what's the sort of progression that happens over a 25-year period in a given nation, typically.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense, because when I'm reading it, I'm thinking, you know, some of it reminds me of the 60s Scoop with the Indigenous communities and the academy, you know, with being very similar to residential schools, or encampment schools. So it's interesting. I'm looking forward to what's going to happen 25 years later, because we're currently there now. So it's to see to see what comes next is very exciting.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about the connection with residential schools is that in almost every colonized nation, there's a story like the residential school system. So even in many African countries, I know my friend was talking, even in Ireland, in these places, there are schools like our residential schools where a nation decides these are the people who can be discarded. These are the people who need to be trained and changed and shaped the way we want to shape them. And in the process of doing that, there are awful things that happen. And so, Livingstone Academy and that sort of experience to me is a reflection of colonization. It's the damage that comes when one group says, we are the authority on goodness, we are the authority on wealth, and this is how you can be like us in that process. And really the damage that's done there too continues to happen now. You continue to see, even in a lot of Caribbean countries, they'll send their kids, their parents will come here to earn a better living and do a better life. And in the process, there's this implication that this is a better place, that this has more opportunity. And there's a real danger in the way we structure the world that way, to say, even you see it with the coronavirus and vaccines, who got vaccines first, who, all these sorts of things impact not just us as a nation in Canada, but on a global scale. We have prioritized the wrong things on a global level, and we've created inequities through that process. And colonization has played a huge role in that. And so, yeah. There's always lots going on in my head, guys. That's a fact.
I like how you bring in, the healers, when the healers kind of go into the gutter and perform their performances. It really reminded me of, what the missionaries and going in and colonizing and trying to oppose religion or the belief system. And then having those people go up and chant that they believe. It was very eerie. It's very eerie because it's very current as well, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's one of my favorite scenes.
Yes.
Oddly.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I always tell people this, that pickle, the pickle in juice is something that actually happened. So I went to Tennessee to visit a family friend, and they volunteer with their church community, and they go into low income communities and give kids pickles in Ziploc bags with Kool-Aid. And I was like, why? It's like, the kids love it. I'm like, but why would you do that? Why? I had so many questions. And so then I had to find a way to put it in the book because it sounded so bizarre. It just couldn't be real. And also the story of the doctors coming in and doing that like once a year healing thing is also something that happens in West Virginia on the mountaintops. There are no doctor's office, no dentists, and there's huge issues with like opioids, with just like teeth rotting and all these sorts of things. And so they just have like once a year, they send a bunch of dentists up there and pull out people's teeth, and then they just leave. And some of these things I saw that were so bizarre, I was just like, I gotta put them in. I gotta find a way to make it in, because I find it so strange what help looks like, honestly.
Yeah, it's tough because even when Elimina asks for to get her debt removed from the healers, and you see that the healer almost wants to do it but knows that they can't. It brings out that savior complex where they're just kind of in that space to almost make themselves feel good, right? Without actually doing the work that needs to be done, which is dismantling that system all in itself.
And I don't know if anyone saw this, but in what was the last election in the States? 2020? I don't know what year that was. 2018? I don't know. I honestly have no idea what time is, but I think it was the 2020 election. LeBron James had started an organization to help prisoners or former prisoners, people who've been released from prison, pay off their debt because they weren't allowed to vote until their debt had been paid. And this is right now, like happening right now. This idea that because they had debt that they weren't citizens who could vote and who could participate in the election. I don't know.
Interesting. Okay. Um,
You guys are all going to go to sleep like stressed out about the world. And I just want to say, bless you, because I feel like these things, I just let you into my 2020, like the whole year. I was just like, what is wrong with the world? What is happening? So
even now, even in 2021, it's like, what is going on?
right. And it hasn't changed enough, honestly, since 2020. And yeah, it's a lot.
I actually believe this madness has been going on for a long time. It's just we've been so distracted, and with COVID shutting things down for a bit, it has given us the opportunity to really look at things, our systems, our people in power with a closer lens. So and people that essentially wouldn't have had the time to do it are making that time and that effort today. And I think that's,
and you see as people's time begins to fill up again, how some of these topics and issues fall by the wayside. It's true.
You also hear people resisting that as well, right? They're kind of resisting, as much as people do want to go back to normal. We've recognized we are overworked, we are underpaid, and there are other solutions out there for us, right? And even when it comes to our elders, with COVID just being how we've treated our elders, I think that's really kind of shaken a few people into realizing what does matter at the end of the day.
And I think part of it is, remembering in terms of Gutter Child, what these systems were designed to do, why we have the healthcare systems we have, why we have the election systems we have, and who that benefits, right? It doesn't benefit any of the parties, especially the two that tend to win. It doesn't benefit either of them to actually reform the electoral process, for example, which would actually give people better say, better impact, better control over the changes that might need to happen. And so the system protects itself. And that's like one of the things I learned writing Gutter Child is the system will protect itself. It will do whatever it can to protect itself. And so at some points, at the end of the book, there's sort of like concessions that are made, things that are given, but they're only given so that they can give as little as possible to continue the system as it is. And so that becomes it's a really interesting thing to explore in the second book, which is just to think about what are the long-term repercussions of that. And yeah.
So I have one question, so I want to get my question in, and then I will ask Jill and Julie's question. So I really appreciate and acknowledge the connection you make with the impacts of the gutter system and the gutter folks and their mental health. It feels very similar to the mental health crisis among Black folks today, just as we spoke. And as a Black woman and a mother of a young son, Rowan's journey can seem too close to reality for some of our young Black male athletes that have the highest aspirations to go pro or make a legendary name for themselves. But then you see the generational trauma rehashed between Rowan Jr. and Geneva, his mother. So my question is, when you cover a few mental health crises throughout the novel with the characters, how did you choose each character, and how did you choose each character would respond or react to their mental health crisis at the time?
This was probably the most difficult thing because I wanted to be honest and genuine. I was really constantly on the barrier of reality and dystopia, right? These imagined worlds were really ways for me to talk about real things. And so I didn't want to have like magical solutions where, you just take a pill and everybody gets better, right? I really wanted to wrestle with them. And my challenge was how much is too much, right? How much trauma to put in there, play in. Violet's story was really difficult for me. I kept thinking like, can something else happen to her? And it kept going there. So Rowan, I will say, was very specific. So when I was researching my dad's story, I ended up coming across a number of Black male athletes who had amazing successes, won Super Bowls, won World Series, won, wherever they were winning big, and then ended up losing everything, homeless, alcoholism, drugs, all these things. And so for me, Rowan's story was very much about me coming to understand why that happened and how their story differed from my dad's. And so David was actually based a lot on my dad's story. My dad was always making the right choice. He's one of those rare people who in the face of difficulty, just made the good but difficult choice. There's one part in the story where my dad's brother is dying of cancer, and my dad just goes to visit him, goes back to school, wins a football game, goes back to classes, goes to visit his brother, and just continues in this pattern for an entire season and doesn't tell anyone about it, right? He just had that kind of like laser focus. So David was based a lot on my dad, and Rowan was my opportunity to kind of see, why would two men who had kind of started out in the same place or ended up in the same place find themselves down very different roads? What kinds of choices does Rowan make that makes what happens to him likely? And what kinds of choices does David make? And then the women, yeah, it was the same kind of thing, right? I wanted to think about different ways of responding to the world. I think Violet was so determined to make her life better and to do well and to succeed. And she was so convinced that she could do it. And I think it meant that she missed signals that things suck. And when she realized that, it was so late and so far and so detrimental that, like, what was she going to do? Right? Like, how else would someone who had believed so much for herself and saw the reality of the world, how else would someone kind of respond in that way? Whereas Josephine, I think, was like more willing to say, like, screw you, I will do what I got to do. I will go where I got to go. I will be in control of my circumstances at every step of the way. And Alameda kind of had to figure out which path she would go down. And so I felt like Josephine, Violet, Rowan, and David, I kind of had a clear sense of like who they were and the choices they would make. And Elamina was the one that was a little bit less predictable. Over the course of the book, I was like, what is she going to do here? How is she going to respond to Mr. Gregors? Or how is she going to respond to Miss Charlotte? What is realistically a girl like Elamina going to do in these moments? So that was kind of, I think, the roots of those difficult moments.
Yeah, it's very nice. It's familiar to see how you create and develop these characters and then implement their mental health into it as well. And then even seeing with
Lewis.
Yeah.
Oh, Lulabelle.
Yeah, Lulabelle.
Yeah.
And like, having her go through her Alzheimer's or forgetting who's who. It's very recognizable in the Black community to see that. So I do have a question from Jill. Did you hope your book would be added to more curriculums in school? Do you know about if your book is being read in schools, if that's something that you're kind of working towards?
Yeah, it's being read in a lot of Peel schools. A number of teachers in the region of Peel I know are using it. I know in Halton as well, there are a few. I just did an event in BC where they're doing it out there. And I've done a number of class visits already. And that's kind of bizarre because the book came out in January, right? So there were teachers who put it in their classrooms the same year it came out. So I'm seeing a little bit more this year of like, it's part of the curriculum. Grade 10s are going to be doing it in this unit. And that's really exciting because honestly, I think it is so important to read a range of stories in school at an early age. I think it makes English classes more interesting. I think it makes them more relevant, right? To be able to be talking about things. I have gotten almost weepy at some of the class visits because to hear the students, there was one group of students, epic, right? They ran the whole conversation. The teacher turned on the video and then there was like a student host, and she like navigated who was asking questions. And there was one point where they started fighting, where one kid was saying like, Miss Charlotte wasn't so bad. And the other kid was like, she wasn't so bad. She was taking advantage of these kids and she's doing these things. And they're going at it. And to hear them really understanding the text and what it could mean for the world, for their world, what they're experiencing now, it's the best, right? Because I just didn't have that experience that early. And so I just keep thinking like, what are they going to do now that they know this so early? What are they going to read? Or what are they going to study in university or college or go on to start businesses that do because they've had these conversations earlier?
Yeah, I think definitely it is useful in the classrooms for sure, because it's relatable. Kids are
Yeah.
going through this right now, and then you can have other kids learn about it through a book that is not necessarily in real life, but
Yeah.
similar to it, that can help them kind of unpack it and digest that. I found that it was definitely appropriate for youth, and how great of a read it was is definitely suitable for the youth to kind of get involved, which I really appreciate that too.
I had a couple of kids who, one was talking about how it related to their lives growing up with parents who were South American. And I had another student talking about the similarities to the caste system in India. And so there's what I'm glad that I did not like specify too deeply the racial makeup of the characters or use terms that we use, because I think that would have kind of ruined it. And it allowed, what I really loved was hearing students talk about SOCI, mainlander, gutter children, and make connections without feeling like they were making statements against their fellow peers, right? I think if you're saying like the white characters are doing this, there's white students, and you say the black characters are doing this, the black students can feel things that can be kind of trauma inducing, can kind of isolate people in the classroom. And so to hear them making these really rich connections to the world by talking about mainlanders and gutter folks and people at the Hill was really lovely.
Mhm, mhm. So we've got one last question from Colleen. Did you name Geneva her name on purpose? And she put in brackets, Geneva Convention.
So I get questions about the names all the time. So I love talking about like how I come up with the names. And there are a couple of mistakes I made in the book, I will say. So I usually just come up with names based on, especially the main characters, based on how I feel or see them. It's like naming your child. You're just like, they seem like a Sam to me, right? Like that's literally Elamina's name came about because I loved the sound of it. And it just felt like that was the main character's name. And there was a song called Elamina. There's a song by a Ghanaian writer who it's called Elamina. And I was like, oh, when I have a book launch, we'll just play the song. And everyone, it was literally that. And it turns out that Elmina is actually the name of a slave castle in Ghana. It's the name of a city in Ghana. And so students have asked me, like, did you name it after this? I'm like, no, it wasn't that profound, honestly, when I started out. And most of the names, so what I usually do is I'll name like the main character, and then I'll actually pick names for everybody else that makes that name work. So starts with a different letter is always important, that none of the characters have names that start with the same letter, that they don't make the same kind of sound, so that when you're reading it or listening to it, you have sort of distinct characters in your mind. And so even the places also, I try not to, Cape Town was one of my mistakes because everyone's like, is that Cape Town in South Africa? And I was like, oh shoot, I should have changed that one. I don't know how I missed it. It just happened. Livingstone was actually named Montgomery Academy initially. And my editor was like, people are going to think about the civil rights movement as soon as they see Montgomery, if that's the first word. And I was like, oh yeah, I should change that. So it's actually named Livingstone was one of the first, David Livingstone was one of the first explorers in Ghana and in some of the African countries. And so that's where I took his name, but everybody else was kind of out of nowhere. So any sort of connections that you make, I'd like to take credit for that, for the Geneva Convention. Elamina, people have talked about illuminate or eliminate. And I'm like, yes, I would also like to take credit for that kind of wisdom, but it was not that profound, unless someone said, maybe it's just like a spiritual thing that happens. Like it comes in your brain and makes it in your book. So sometimes I claim that it's a spiritual thing that made its way in, and I didn't even see it happening.
I definitely appreciate that. The spirits are guiding you. Well, I'm going to be mindful of the time, and I would really want to really say thank you. It was an honor to co-host you this evening and your book, Gutter Child. Again, thank you again for coming out, and I'm going to hand it over back to Danielle.
Yeah, so on behalf of the Halton Hills Public Library and the Friends of the Halton Hills Public Library, I want to thank both of you, so Jael Richardson and Janelle Thomas, for joining us tonight. This has been a fantastic discussion. There's been lots of great questions also from the audience, so thank you to everyone who participated. And yeah, really enjoyed hearing the deep dive into your mind and finding out what was all behind the book.
Sleep well, everyone. But thank you for having me.
Thank you.
And I
so
will add for everyone in the audience, if you did enjoy tonight's event, we do have additional authors and guest speakers joining us this fall. So many of these programs are actually part of Culture Days. And if you don't know, Culture Days is an annual celebration of the arts and is kicking off on September 24th this year. So for events in our area, you can check the library's website, or you can go to culturedays.ca as well to find out more about what's happening across the province and across Canada. So once again, thank you to everyone who joined us tonight, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening.